For our next panel, I'd like to ask Captain Wolfgang Koch and his panel to please take the stage. So when the pandemic struck, not only did we have to deal with the immediate reductions in flights, but we also saw a staggering increase in unruly passenger events that threaten the safety and security of our flights. Captain Koch?
As Abby mentioned, my name is Wolfgang Koch. I am privileged to be the Air Safety Organization Air Security Chair. As we get ready for our last panel of the day, I'd like to turn our attention to the security aspect of our aviation ecosystem. Just this past Sunday, we remembered the horrific attacks of 9/11 and maintain our resolve to never forget, never again. On 9/11, we learned the vulnerability of the flight deck and are reminded almost daily that the threat persists. The Department of Homeland Security's June 2022 National Threat Advisory System Bulletin stated that the United States remains in a heightened threat environment in which aviation has been and continues to be a target of foreign adversaries' violence. We must also alter our mindset that a foreign threat is the primary or only security concern. The FAA has seen a disturbing increase in incidents where airline passengers have disrupted flights with the threatening or violent types of behavior. Case in point, in 2021, there were nearly 6,000, and I repeat, there were 6,000 unruly passenger reports, and in the past few years, unruly passenger incidents have exponentially increased. Today, we will discuss the reality of a security threat that has never gone away, as demonstrated by the numerous attempted flight deck attacks and even a number of cases where perpetrators were successful in partially entering the flight deck only to be pulled by flight attendants assisted by passengers. Aviation security threats evolve every day, and extensive security controls developed by all stakeholders in the aviation environment have allowed for the prevention and mitigation of these threats. Today, we have a distinguished panel to discuss the evolution of in-flight disturbances. I won't read through each of their bios. I'll ask you to maybe present yourself a little bit there, but they are readily available on your app in front of you. With us today, Jeffrey Fuller, Supervisory Special Agent with the FBI to discuss investigations. Terrell Stevens, Executive Assistant Administrator, Director of Law Enforcement, Federal Air Marshal Service from the Transportation Security Administration. Kaori Paris, who represents ALPA on the FAA's Air Carrier Training and Aviation Rulemaking Committee De-escalation Training Enhancement Work Group. Thomas Kamansky, Alaskan Air Director of In-Flight Training and Standards, to share with us as an operational perspective. And Phil Gower, ALPA's Director of Security for our Canadian pilots, and will provide a perspective on Canadian operations. To better understand the current aviation security environment and the evolution of in-flight security threats, we will be discussing how each stakeholder is adapting to ever-changing in-flight disturbances. Starting with Jeff, what new initiatives is the FBI using to prevent, mitigate, and respond to in-flight disturbances as they evolve?
It's a good question. For the FBI, it's mostly business as usual. We've had a couple of public service announcements that we put out. Anytime some of the more egregious cases are adjudicated at court, the U.S. Attorney's Office always put out a press release, and we try to tie that into the increasing numbers that are happening. But for us, I mean, we were doing this before the pandemic. For those of you who don't know, I run the Civil Aviation Security Program for the FBI, and our program has approximately 400 airport liaison agents, FBI agents, task force officers at the bigger airports around the country. And so this is a daily activity. One of the things we had to kind of work through was how do we respond to every single event when not all of the events are something that we're going to be able to prosecute. A lot of the reports of unruly passengers, they started off with people just not wanting to wear masks and causing problems. Well, unless there's specific activity by that individual, we don't have jurisdiction there. And when I would forward out reports or call one of my agents out in the field, one of the first responses I would get back would be, well, we're not the mask police, so we don't have to deal with this. That was in the early portions of the pandemic. Once air travel started to pick back up and our guys were all back in the office, they really had to kind of change their mindset due to the rapidly increasing number of reports that were coming out. So we started taking a look at each one individually. One of the things that we had to do was work closely with our U.S. Attorney's Office partners to decide what was the appropriate level to push forward for prosecution, because in some places they were coming in fairly fast and furious. Other places it was, again, business as usual. And then the letter that the aviation industry, and ALPA in particular, sent to the Attorney General, I think that helped a lot also. When the Attorney General put out a statement saying that he wanted the U.S. Attorney's offices to put more emphasis on these cases, put more resources toward it, that helped us quite a bit. A lot of times it was sometimes a battle to get resources from the different judicial districts to help prosecute some of these cases, depending on the resources they had at the time and how busy they were. So again, for us, maybe in some places there was really not much of a change. Other places, they had to look for more resources, where some of my airport teams would prosecute cases. Others, they had to go back to the field office and request some of the criminal squads to come in and take some of the load off and push those forward for prosecution. So not really new initiatives, but a little bit of a change in mindset, a little bit of reaching out for more resources.
Very good. Thank you. For some background, the TSA develops roadmaps and corresponding implementation plans for cross-cutting and emerging subject areas to articulate a common vision for the TSA enterprise and external partners towards common goals and objectives. Terrell, we understand there's a new TSA roadmap in the making. Can you please provide a quick brief of that roadmap and how it ties into in-flight disturbances and management of that?
Sure. Thanks, Wolfgang. The TSA roadmap that you speak of is really specific to LEFAMS, Law Enforcement Federal Air Marshal Service. And that roadmap is really, at its simplest form, a recognition of the experience that we've gained over 21 years operating within the aviation industry, and the acknowledgement that we as a service have the capability of really raising the baseline of baseline security by immersing ourselves throughout this TSA layered security approach at earlier levels or earlier stages of that layered approach, in such a way that we could impact some of these evolving threats and evolving situations that are presenting themselves. As an example, as we talk about just in FBI's response to in-flight security or in-flight disturbances, the expectation is as we start to implement a development strategy for this roadmap, there's an opportunity for us to reallocate resources from an in-flight security model into the actual aviation domain, where we can assist not only state and local law enforcement, but also our federal partners at FBI with response to aircraft as they return to the gate with these disturbances, and possibly even bridge that gap between state and local criminal offenses that are occurring, and the, if you will, high crimes that generally are really kind of consume more of the FBI's time, by really filling the void with the middle ground of criminal offenses that may be occurring, where we can apply both resources and investigative expertise in order to address issues in a way that raises the baseline of security, not only for the aviation industry, but also raising the baseline security for the actual airport itself. Another piece of the roadmap includes our ability to train not only our partners, but our stakeholders. And so one of the programs that we're really focusing on is our crew member self-defense. And the crew member self-defense training, which has trained not only our flight attendants, but at this point, either other operators in the airport environment, the intent is to provide them the skills necessary to de-escalate a situation before it becomes one that could cause more injury to both our crew members or passengers, or rises to the occasion that it threatens the flight deck. To that point, we've been very successful this year. I believe we've trained up to 4,600 this year. That number is increasing on a daily basis, and within the roadmap, we have an expectation to actually create a mobile training platform where we can provide training throughout the country, where space is provided, where we can bring in flight attendants or in larger groups in order to provide really more value to the program itself. The third thing that I want to mention in terms of the roadmap is really the ability for us to really pivot from only focusing on that last line of defense. From a federal air marshal perspective, we spent 21 years primarily focused on in-flight security operations that were targeting protection of the flight crew, the flight deck, and the passengers. That hasn't changed. What will change is really a focus on addressing those threats before they reach the aircraft in a way that makes the aircraft and the aviation environment more secure. And we believe that this plan, as we begin to work with our partners, our stakeholders, our law enforcement partners as well, will really benefit not only us, but the greater domain.
Very good. So I see how the resourcing, the allocation is going both ways now to the FBI's ALAs, which is a big plus. That's great. Thank you. Kaori, as a participant of the FAA's Air Carrier Training Aviation Rulemaking Committee, De-escalation Training Enhancement Work Group. Boy, that's a long title there. What work is the FAA taking as disturbances evolve?
Appreciate that. Thank you, Captain. Yes, it was a long name, but I was representing ALPA. We are part of the De-escalation Training Enhancement Working Group, and I would like to give you the update on what we worked on as a group. So we're reporting to the Air Carriers Training Aviation Rulemaking Committee, and it's shortened for the ACTARC. And our group initially met at February of 2020, and we met just average about once a month or so. And then as we got closer to the reporting time, we actually got a little more active with the subcommittees. And we actually sent the final report as of last year and got accepted to the steering committee, and now it's in the hands of FAA. And we had initially met with this group of wonderful people, really try to look at was this due to the heightened numbers of all these in-flight disturbances, and can we actually take a look at the flight attendants training, and can we actually look at the better enhancement of a de-escalation process, and are the flight attendants getting the right tools, and also the training to really conduct effectively. And this group actually had a leadership, of course, being this flight attendant being the first line of defense. They are the lead on this particular project, but ALPA, us as an ALPA, was lucky enough to be part of it to really assist in hands with this wonderful group of people. Co-leaders were from AFA leadership and also the American Union side of people, and then also A4A was a great presence taking the leadership along with the RAA for the regional flight attendant side. Us as a pilot assisting, and also the FAA, TSA, all of us. And we also, de-escalation, meaning having a huge psychological background for it. We had some of the subject matter experts chiming in on us to really get the best advice possible. 5 scope of works that we mainly worked on is a standardization of the terminologies and definition pertaining to de-escalation training. Next thing was finding out the trigger points and really find out what is contributing to misconduct in the cabin. Best practices to de-escalate misconduct in the cabin, and effective crew communication tactics, including the concept of CRM. And the last but not least, we worked on the coordination and communication, including possible involvement with the LEO and ABP in the de-escalation process. As we started this group, we actually have about 16 airlines or so. We surveyed them in both in the in-flight training side of things and also the frontline flight attendants to really get their inputs to really make the better recommendations. The first thing we did is looking from the data points and data reporting. Are the data that needs to be backed into the actual effective communication and also give the advice to the, so we looked at the data, and we also looked at the current procedure and training, and then we made the recommendation accordingly. The first one that we did was, of course, to telling the FAA to advise them for the definition and de-escalation terminology to be standardized. So the subgroup of us actually worked we met in the subcommittee several times, look at all the tables of pages pertaining to the de-escalation factor and make sure that we're all on the same page about all the terminology pertaining to our advice. And some of them are straight up from the CF 114, 121, and or this advisory circular. So those are actually the standard terminology. There's not really room for any kind of interpretation, but we have things like validation or zero tolerance, and what that means. So some of the terminologies are coming from the dictionary straight up or Psychology Today. So we met with the group and make sure that all the terminologies were all standard. Next thing was the trigger points. What are the trigger points right now? So FAA should be continually looking at some of the data points to make sure that we really capture the clear data points of what is going on in the real time in terms of the de-escalation. So we have like a safety reporting system, and we looked at the sample, say for instance from 2003 to 2020, a lot of things can be things like smoking or alcohol related, but as you know, at 2020 on, a lot of things became the masking compliance and such. So the short term of FAA's guidance to make sure that you're capturing all this data, to make sure you give the air carriers the recommendation to really have an on-time in real life training was a key. Next recommendation that we made was about to actually look at the training procedures. And some of the sub-recommendation was like harmonize, the technology or integrate the use of operation manual. Some of the training to make sure it's memorable, whether or not it's role-playing or CVT or actual initial training. And it's not one-size-fits-all kind of training, but we wanted to make sure some of these were memorable so that flight attendants know to use it in the real time. And the last but not least, but with this subcommittee's work on a de-escalation best practice guide is what I really was impressed with the subcommittee group on the in-flight subject matter expert worked on, is to give them a clear guidance on how to de-escalate. So establishing report or communicate or problem solving or what to avoid to be effectively de-escalate the situation. And so we actually have appendix and also the supplement that went into the report. The fourth recommendation we made was FAA's to make sure that concept of CRM actually gets incorporated into de-escalation training. Some of the CRM thing we think of that as in the cockpit side and also and the flight deck side and also the in-flight side, what are some of the CRM keywords would be like a situation awareness, task allocation, or using all the resources available. And we wanted to emphasize the fact the same concept that the very thing that we already trained on should be actually applied into a de-escalation training. And last but not least, we actually discussed the use of LEO and ABP as part of de-escalation, and the group actually recommended that. and the initial flight attendant being the first line of defense, at all time, it was a trained professional as a flight attendant should really effectively do the de-escalation. But if that's not effective, or if it got going to the containment period, then use of ABP, LEO, and of course us being in the flight deck side of things for the right handoff coordinations are necessary, and those are the key factors. So as I said, these 5 key components, the report has already been submitted as of last year, so really my sincere hope that air carriers can actually get this information from FAA to use the effective training.
Fantastic. That's good stuff. I like to hear that. You know, this segues perfectly into our next speaker. And Thomas, from the airline perspective, what new initiatives is Alaskan Airlines taking on to adapt the constant evolution of in-flight disturbances? And I understand you've also worked on that ARC, and I'm curious, very curious to hear how your department has gone forward with this ever-ending problem that we have.
Yeah, great question. Thank you. So I'll speak to Alaska, and then of course I'll speak a little bit to industry in general. Consistent with the suggestions put forward in the report on de-escalation training, one of the most important features or most important recommendations I think we have for airlines is to look at your data streams, right? And to make sure that you're keeping a good pulse on what is happening in your operation. Carrie made mention that, I mean, it's no surprise to anybody in this room, and you even mentioned a little bit earlier backstage that Canada is still having some issue with masks, right? And that was a huge, huge thing. What we're seeing now is the data trend is going back to kind of our normal passenger disruptions that are fueled by smoking, vaping, alcohol, and those sorts of things. So from the Alaska side, what we're doing is we're really trying to make sure that we're staying on top of the data streams, what they're telling us. Additionally, taking a look at our training and our policies and procedures. One of the things that we saw when we looked kind of across industry at the different in-flight departments is that we all have some sort of model for our flight attendants to deal with passenger disruptions, whether they're focused on gaining compliance with perhaps the CFR, or if they are more of a customer service recovery tool. But what we didn't see kind of universally across the board is true de-escalation techniques that include the types of techniques that you would see in, say, for example, a healthcare environment, in a psychiatric care environment, or even in law enforcement. So part of the recommendation and part of what we're doing at Alaska is trying to take a look at what are the policies and procedures and training that we have in place, and where do we address the gaps. And I'll give a really salient example. One of the elements of de-escalation that we uncovered as we looked through the literature and we looked through the best practices of some other industries is knowing when to engage, for example. And sometimes it is actually better not to engage or to make sure that your engagement is appropriate to whatever the situation is. So doing that analysis kind of on the policies and procedures side will inform, along with our data, how we want to change training programs moving forward. The difficult thing with any of these training programs and what we saw in the literature is that this can't be a one and done, and it needs to be something that lives in perpetuity in the same way that CRM does. So that's what we're doing at Alaska to kind of take a holistic view of what is the data telling us, are there nuances in the data, where are our policy and procedure gaps, where are the knowledge and skill gaps, and what is the longer term vision for creating something that is more of a long-term solution as opposed to a one and done type of training element.
Very good. You know, I'd like to follow on to that as something that we spoke about earlier. Just, do you think there could be an opportunity to redefine the threat levels that we use today, as in the common strategy, threat level 1 through 4? And I ask you that question because you're doing all this research and trying to figure out how do we best combat the disruptive passenger nature. But there's also that response from the security apparatus, from the ground in the air. And throughout my years of experience with the common strategy, threat levels 1 through 4, it's evident that there's sometimes a confusion that goes on with, hey, we have a threat level 3, 2, 1, whatever it may be. But through your studies, through managing the data and maybe debriefing a lot of the crews, do you find that there may be room for a new type of system that you could look at?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I've had a chance to even reflect on it since we spoke on it earlier. And I think, what I'll do is, before I actually answer your question, is be a little bit philosophical, right?
Yep.
So I started as a flight attendant back in the 90s, and common strategy, as we know, back then was quite different from what we see today. And the goal was really just to kind of be passive, right? And then 9/11 and the introduction of these 4 threat levels really, I think, right, wrong, or indifferent, has potentially increased the difference in perception and power authority distance between customer and flight attendant. And no flight attendant would ever, say that they shouldn't have the authority, right? And they should, because they are the safekeepers of the cabin environment. But when it comes right down to it, and there is literature supporting this, the customer doesn't recognize that power authority distance. So that's a very real complication and a very real challenge. But I think in scope of these threat levels, the thing that gives me a little bit of pause in your question is that we have psychological professionals who disagree on how to diagnose behaviors in the moment, and it gives me a little bit of anxiety to think about how we would potentially equip flight attendants to make even further determinations on, say, for example, the motivation of a person's behavior. So what I think the threat levels have done for us now compared to pre-9/11 is it has allowed us to develop observable behaviors that become the markers for which flight attendants react, and there's a script for that reaction, right? I think part of one of the things that we were even talking about backstage is the difference in perception of severity at a level 2 versus a level 3 even, right? Where, a flight attendant at level 3, we're getting ready to take somebody down, right? And I know, you talked about as long as they're behind first class, maybe that's not quite as big of a deal for me, but it is for them because not only is physical safety involved, but the concept of psychological safety is also involved. So I think, from a practitioner standpoint, and this is where I finally answer your question, I promise, is that whilst I think there's always room to relook at things, I think what that common strategy has provided us now is a very methodological, good way of identifying behaviors and the expected responses from the cabin crew. That doesn't mean it's perfect, and I think we always have the opportunity to relook at it. But the meta question that I took away from your question is, should we be looking a little bit deeper at what is the form or function of the disruption? Is it alcohol based? Is it medical? And that does give me a little bit of anxiety.
Very good. Thank you. Yeah, that's thought-provoking there, so thank you. Phil, Canada has some of the most unique flying in North America that lends to different safety and security risks. In what ways are Canada operations adapting to the evolving in-flight disturbance events?
So to start off with, if I had the RCMP, CATSA, Transport Canada here, same panel, they'd be able to, they're going to parallel everything that you said. The issues in our southern airports are the same as what you're experiencing in the States. We're getting the same thing in Canada. So I'm just going to go up a little further north, so it's a little bit more unique on this part. So when you hear me talking now, it's not our southern airports, our ICAO standard airports. but I'll talk about our northern airports where ALPA pilots fly. And these airports have no security. So about 9 months ago, things started becoming highlighted with the aggressiveness of passengers. So we've had a passenger, and these are smaller airlines, invade the flight deck. The FO had to push her out, throw her onto the floor, get other passengers to hand her down, get back into the flight deck, and land the plane with the captain. We've had a passenger get violent on landing, where the crew had to lock the passenger in the lav in order to get the people out. The next one was a passenger became violent, and the FO had to go back with a flashlight and fight him. The captain went off to get help, but the police were out in the parking lot in another fight, so they couldn't get on. So that bloodied the whole cabin. Let's see, I'll just throw one more in here just because there's a few of them. So we got the hijacking lady. They've had to restrain them while they're landing, while the captain has landed. So the FO's actually had to restrain a passenger, and the captain's landing the plane by himself. So these are the issues that we're dealing with, and so we had to come up with a plan. And so with myself and our Canada board members and our staff at ALPA, because obviously we can't do this without our staff, but we decided we'd work on an information campaign, because a lot of times when these passengers are getting off, they're just taken off the flight and put on the next day. They might be charged with drunk and disorderly, just minor things. And so the local police just had no concept of Aeronautics Act, different charges that could be applied to them. And the government wasn't really aware. So there's two things that we did. We started the information campaign with the local police authorities, and just basically we could charge them under the Criminal Code 76 for hijacking, 77 disruption of an aircraft on the land or in air, just to say, look, we got to make these charges more severe because this is just out of control. Because our whole idea, our whole plan is to get security at the airports, because this is what's happening. People are just walking on and there's no security. We've been writing our letters to our Director General for Security, making them aware, giving them the instances that this is happening. And so the information is out there, they're aware, they know that there's a problem here. You know, after 9/11, it was an international threat. As you guys are all saying here, this is domestic threats. And so 20 years ago, when I talked to some of these pilots, this wasn't like this, say, 5 years ago. The violence just wasn't there. So now it's time to get the security, or some form of security, into these airports. It's a long process, it's a political process, but you know, there are ALPA members, and that's who we have to represent, and so that's a big part of our file right now that we're dealing with in Canada.
Interesting. Have you had any feedback from Transport Canada on these initiatives?
The positive thing, we have a new Director General, and when we met up with him, I think probably about a month ago, and he was quite receptive to us, so that was really good. It's good when you have a good relationship with your government, and you say, hey, our phone's here, our door's open, got a problem, give us a call. So with the flashlight incident, Transport Canada is actually going up to investigate and talk to these pilots. I'm kind of hoping, and that's just hoping that's that move forward for them maybe starting to do their due diligence, that, hey, we got to investigate this, we got to go through a process, and hopefully we'll move this way to start getting security at these airports. On a smaller note, this company in particular, they've on their own started training their flight attendants on de-escalation training, because it's just right there, and it's small, and that's what they need.
Very good. Thomas, I'd like to get back into another question that you brought up. You were mentioning that the level of where the flight attendants respect with the passenger and I guess the expectation of the passenger and the authority of the flight attendant. And you're scaling the training to accommodate the disruption. How much of that is also being considered as to what the FARs dictate? Are you finding there are problems there with managing that, or are you going with pretty much what the FARs are saying in authority for the flight attendants?
So let me rephrase just to kind of make sure I'm answering the right
Sure.
question. What I hear you asking is, how are we managing kind of the difference between customer behavior as just maybe a little cutesy mouth, my words, to getting into a point of threat? Is that kind of a fair?
That's pretty much it.
Yeah, so I think it's a great question, and as the work group, we actually had very robust conversation about this, because to the point of the difference between level 2 and level 3, as a work group, when we really started looking at this, one of the kind of the tipping points, if you will, is that there does come a point where we're no longer dealing with somebody who's just being ugly or belligerent or whatever. We're actually getting to a point where we tip the scale to there's actually a safety concern, right? There's a security concern. And as we look at how to prepare flight attendants to identify that, the way I kind of compartmentalize that is you're moving from something that's just uncomfortable, perhaps you have a compliance issue, but you don't have a full-fledged security / safety issue. But you have to be very, very careful of watching for the point where you're getting to, now I have a problem that I need to contain. This is no longer a de-escalation matter, this is a containment matter to make sure that we're maintaining the safe environment in the cabin. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's good. Good explanation. Very good. All right, I'd like to open up the questions to the audience, or any other questions we may have from our apps. Sir.
Good afternoon. I'm Andy Uribe from the Delta MEC. I'd like to thank the panel for their time today. I have 2 questions, Mr. Kaminsky. Recently, I was on a flight where we had a disruptive passenger, and law enforcement met us and took that passenger off the airplane. In the end, the captain and purser were involved with police for about 2 hours. So I know there's some reluctance with crew members sometimes to report because they're feeling the operational pressure to keep that schedule going. What can be done from a company standpoint to make sure these processes, important processes, are seen through and address that reluctance?
That's a really great point, and I think it's interesting that the flight attendant's getting all the questions here. But I think, so one of the things that has been a little bit of a challenge in training throughout my career with flight attendants is kind of this feeling that, hey, this thing happened on the airplane, right? And we know that law enforcement got involved, or maybe even the FAA or FBI got involved, but we don't really know what happened beyond that. So from a training standpoint, in the programs that I've led, is really helping flight attendants understand what is it that law enforcement needs to carry on investigation, beyond the incident as it happens. Your question is really more of an operational question, and I'm not sure that I can answer that, kind of on behalf of all U.S. carriers, but what I think is important to note that, and I might even, ask our friend from the FBI to weigh in here, is making sure that whomever the customer is that has caused the disruption or has caused the violation or whatever, that we positively identify that person so that things can happen after the fact. I don't know from a law enforcement perspective what needs to be handled there on the jet bridge versus what can be handled later. So maybe you can add some
Yeah, absolutely.
context.
In a best case scenario, the FBI or local law enforcement is notified with enough time to actually arrive as the plane is arriving. So you're there at the door, waiting for the crew to open the door. And if that is the case, you can get a statement immediately from the flight crew, from any witnesses, and also pull the passenger in particular, pull them aside, and you're typically outside the plane in one of the hold rooms or something with local law enforcement, and you sit down and you figure out what happened. From that point, it's usually a decision made between the FBI and a assistant U.S. attorney, somebody from the U.S. Attorney's Office, whether we have enough for what's called a probable cause arrest. If we can, put handcuffs on them right there and take them and lock them up. And usually that's going to be a discussion that's going to happen after the agents have gotten enough information. Typically what happens, because that's not always the case, a lot of times depending on which airport it is, who's available, what time of day or night it is, they may not get there until after the plane has arrived, passengers have already deboarded. If you're lucky, your local law enforcement partners have held that passenger aside and perhaps convinced the flight crew to stay and give statements. The biggest thing that we're looking for is statements from any victims, any witnesses, flight crew that was victim or witness, and contact information. If we show up after everybody's left, it's not an optimum situation, but if we have contact information from everybody, we can get them on the phone the next day and talk to them about it then. Even if the passenger gets to leave the airport that night, we can still make a decision later on as to whether they're going to be arrested, and that would happen through either an indictment or a complaint, and they would be called back to that particular judicial district to face the judge and potentially a jury. So I hope I'm answering the question and not getting off track. But yeah, the biggest thing we need is statements and contact information for all the involved parties.
Thanks. To follow up, and just to kind of stick with the crew actions theme, Special Agent Fuller, have there been any partnerships or communication methods that have been developed, in the last few years that would help facilitate or encourage that reporting?
We've had some requests for forms. They said, can you design a form for us so that we can fill it out and give you all the appropriate information? But it's even simpler than that. We don't need to create a form. We just need a simple statement and contact information. And I've seen it come on the back of a napkin. Somebody's written out a quick statement. If there's a pad of paper that's somewhere, somebody notes down seat numbers of witnesses, they get their contact information, and then they can hand that to us, when we first arrive or even after the fact. It's, every airport is different with our teams on the ground, your local law enforcement, the airlines, and how every individual incident is also unique in how the communication flows and how people are notified. Sometimes it works beautifully, other times it doesn't work so well. So there's not really one size fits all method that anybody's been able to come up with. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you very much.
Very good. Center stage.
Thanks, Captain Koch. My question's for Mr. Stevenson. Regarding the FAA Reauthorization Act in 2018, can you talk to us a little bit about the initiatives that the Federal Air Marshal Service is taking regarding international harmonization with federal flight deck officer expansion and procedures?
Sure. So for those, I'm sure most here are aware, the harmonization program involves the really the collaboration of attempting to create country agreements for FFDOs to be armed, entering into countries that essentially FAMs have those same country agreements at. At this point, we have, I believe it's 3 countries that we have agreements at. It appears that that we're starting to gain inroads with 2 or 3 other countries. We also have it in terms of the budget to increase the numbers of personnel that are budgeted to assist in that harmonization process. I believe that we're looking at that within the FY24 budget in terms of the uptake of personnel. And the goal continues to be to support that program and to expand the number of countries in a manner that really kind of fits the bill in terms of what I would call I guess reasonability, right? So there's some countries that are going to take a lot of work and a lot of inroads through the TSAR, through the Department of State, where we're expecting for it to take several months and years to really kind of get to the early stages of an agreement. Where there's other countries that have already expressed the possibility that we could tag on within agreements that we're already working through with federal air marshals, where we could probably expedite that process. We're supporting it. We expect that it'll continue to grow, and within the next year or 2, that we will have additional personnel that'll be actively working on increasing the numbers of country agreements for FFDOs.
Great, thank you.
Sir.
Hey, good afternoon. I'm Darren Dorn. I'm the Security Vice Chairman for ALPA National. This question's directed towards you, Mr. Stevenson. 20-year anniversary for FFDOs is coming up next year. We just passed the 21st anniversary of 9/11. As we look back on that, I'm just going to cite a couple things for people that don't know, and I'm sure you're aware. FFDOs have flown 20 million missions armed in support of this nation. And the average cost of those missions over 19 years for people is $20. That's what it costs to put an FFDO in the seat. 90% of all armed flights are covered by FFDOs. That says a lot for the validity of this program. It's one of the cheapest in-flight security programs out there. Matter of fact, FFDOs are the largest in-flight security organization in the world on the armed side. FAMs are hitting a 20-year peak on their retirement. You're probably at the lowest numbers you've seen post 9/11 buildup. So your roadmap is going to pull more of those flying FAMs out and put them into ground-based assignments. Right now, FFDO training slots are limited. We all know we took a big hit on COVID. A large percentage of FFDOs left. The training was stopped by FLETC's requirements. And so now we've got a limited amount of slots. We want to thank you for the money you gave the program to get us some people this year. But next year, limited slots. Right now, we have a 3-year training log of FFDOs waiting to go to training. So my 2 questions to you are, would you support an Atlantic City initial training site that TSA controls?
Well, thank you, first of all, for giving what I could only describe as a very in-depth briefing on the current state
Hey,
of
sir, I
the
was super
Federal
careful.
Flight
No
Technology
SSI was
Program.
out there.
To your point, federal flight deck officers have actually flown 20,500,000
Okay.
missions.
I'm gonna have to hit them up. I'm one of your stakeholders that goes to the meeting. I was there last week.
Please do that. The tally continues, so that may be the delta. We fully, let me make this perfectly clear. The Federal Air Marshal Service, the Law Enforcement Federal Air Marshal Service fully supports the Federal Flight Deck Officer Program, we recognize the continued value that it provides within the in-flight security operations model within the TSA layered security approach. And we will continue, much as we already have this year with the money that we have transferred into the Federal Flight Deck Officer budget, in order to jumpstart the continued classes or the jumpstart of the classes at FLETC. We will continue to support the program in a way that allows it to return to its previous numbers and beyond. Our goal is well, we have a number of goals. Our first goal is to, first of all, get the tempo back in terms of initial classes for Federal Flight Deck officers, with the hopes of that being done within the structure of FLETC as it stands right now, because it's easier to work within the structure that we have as we continue to build a structure that we control, be it at ACY or Atlanta. Our second goal is to increase the throughput of our current training program, which is in Atlanta currently, also in ACY and in Dallas, in order to maintain and sustain the population that's currently operating within the program. And then thirdly, the goal is to, at some point in the future, continue to think through what it would look like to control our own training facility in order to build up the program and be able to manage our own throughput. As you know, these things don't happen overnight. They also come with price tags that we're willing to really kind of take a serious look at and really be able to kind of own in terms of accountability. But it takes more than 1 year money. It takes that ability to get the money and then to have it sustainably placed into the budget in out years. But we're very supportive of the long-term vision and continued partnership with the FFD program as it falls within LE-FAMS.
Well, I want to thank you for that support. Second question is really easy. We got a stakeholder meeting at TSA headquarters in December, first week. We've asked the program manager if you could attend that. We'd love to have you out and further that relationship.
I'll see you there.
All righty.
All right, well, thank you for your remarks. To conclude, I'd like to highlight that ALPA has been and will continue to be an unwavering advocate for aviation security. We will continue to stand in support of the mandate and implementation of secondary barriers on all commercial aircraft. As threats evolve, we will support to continue the growth of the Federal Flight Deck Officer Program and crew member self-defense. I would like to thank you all, our partners on stage today, for providing their perspectives and continuing to maintain the highest level of aviation security. Thank you very much.